Thank you, Mr. President. The meetings initiated by our Western colleagues in Ukraine are based on the same, rather primitive pattern. Russia accuses Ukraine of strikes on Ukrainian cities, trying to prove without evidence that the objects of attacks are allegedly civilian objects. It has ignored the fact that during our strikes, victims among the civilian population appear exclusively as a result of the fall of the wreckage of the shot-down missiles or drones, or directly shot down from the course of the missiles of the Ukrainian air defense. The reason for this is also known: the placement of Ukrainian air defense facilities in residential buildings in violation of the basic standards of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. At the same time, the purposeful Ukrainian attacks using drones on civilian facilities in Russia are trying to be silenced. Here is a simple scheme, a template for which our Western colleagues, who today again, for some reason, gathered in this hall like a herring in a barrel, could have entrusted writing to artificial intelligence a long time ago. It is so inhuman and detached from reality. Perhaps they are already doing so because we have not heard anything new coming out of this template today. My answer to these accusations today is also unlikely to contain anything new. Yes, we really were striking on the night of August 27, 28, within the framework of the implementation of the task of demilitarization of Ukraine, on objects related to the military-industrial complex of this country. As the Ministry of Defense of Russia reported today, the infrastructure of 62% of the key enterprises of the Ukrainian aerospace forces is already armed. Military airfields, air defense warehouses, hangars, platforms, and other transport energy units in a number of Ukrainian regions were hit. Thus, in Kyiv and the Kyiv region, the main targets were the enterprises of the defense industrial complex, including the Artem plant, the Kyiv radio plant, the special defense of MASH, Slavutich, Ukrspec systems. They were engaged directly in the development and production of various types of air defense equipment. They housed the power for the repair and release of radio location stations, fire control systems, and communications equipment of the Air Force, assembly lines, and warehouses of the Ukrainian army. At the same time, the Kyiv regime, as before, shamelessly and criminally used the tactics of a live shield, placing the enterprises of the defense complex, the air defense and radio equipment, near residential buildings in densely populated areas of the cities. Therefore, it is not surprising that the missiles of the Ukrainian air defense again fell on residential quarters. This was the reason for the damage to the buildings of the UK and EU representatives, as well as the deaths of civilians in partially destroyed residential buildings. However, such victims not only do not force the criminal regime to remove the air defense and military enterprises from residential quarters, but they are ready to use them as a tool for political manipulation. Each such tragedy is deliberately blown up in order to accuse the Ukrainian citizens of the death of Russia, appeal to Western sponsors and international donors, demand the introduction of new sanctions, and demand new arms deliveries. This is what happened today. In our eyes, with the participation of the Western members of the security service, the lives of peaceful residents of Ukraine turn into a bargaining chip, and human suffering becomes a means of achieving narrow-minded foreign policy goals. Against the background of the hopeless hypocrisy of our Western colleagues and their unwillingness to reveal the true cause of the death of people, the situation has long been understood by Ukrainian citizens. They quickly realized that the Ukrainian air defense systems, not the Russian strikes, pose a danger to them. Don't you believe me? Read the Ukrainian social network. For a long time now, people have been warning each other about the placement of air defense systems and military production near their homes, ironizing the Western colleagues above you and your clumsy attempts to outsmart the criminal Kyiv regime. Mr. Chairman, there is one more point that turns today's meeting into a spectacle of theater of absurdity. By inciting victims and destruction in Ukrainian cities, Western initiators of today's meeting are deliberately ignoring the planned hunt for peaceful citizens, including women, children, and elderly people, on the territory of Russia. The Ukrainian Nazis are purposefully sending strike drones to apartment buildings and private residential buildings, civil transport, agricultural machinery, and commercial and social facilities. Dozens and hundreds of drones are launched daily in Russian regions. Only a week ago, from August 18 to 24, 140 civilians were killed by the Ukrainian Nazis. 121 people were injured, including 8 minors. 19 people, including 1 child, were killed. These victims are of no interest to our Western colleague. They are part of their strategy to harm Russia with the help of Ukraine, for which this anti-Russia project was created. In addition, the fact that our combined strike on the facilities of the Ukrainian aerospace forces was carried out in response to the attacks on oil refineries of the Russian plant in Alaska that took place over the past 2 weeks. It is obvious that these strikes are of no strategic military importance, as they do not affect the situation on the line of combat. Their true goal is to try to damage the civil energy infrastructure, to cause interruptions in fuel supply. Moreover, such actions are expected to provoke retaliatory measures from Russia, to present them in a distorted form as disproportionate, and then to accuse Moscow of sabotaging any attempts at peace talks. In this context, the strikes on the Druzhba pipeline, one of the key routes of oil supplies to Europe, are indicative. The last diversion on August 22nd was so serious that the pipeline failed for several days. In this case, we are talking about a provocation intended to damage the economic interests of the EU countries and the infrastructure that ensures the energy stability of the region. Even the European Commission was forced to react to this under pressure from Hungary and Slovakia. In other words, the consequences of Russia's retaliatory measures do not mention the fact that these strikes provoked them. This is not a cunning and hypocritical tactic that only demonstrates the selectiveness and blindness of the double standards of our Western colleagues. Mr. Chairman, the same double standards are most clearly visible in the ongoing ignorance of the Western traitors of the Kyiv regime and in the escalating violations of human rights by the Zelensky regime. Among other things, we are talking about massive violations of human rights and freedoms, including those of the Russian-speaking population. We are talking about hatred, persecution, attempts to put the canonical Orthodox Church out of law. According to the most modest estimates, about 7,000 Ukrainians have been deprived of their freedom for political reasons. These are the clergymen of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and journalists, as well as ordinary citizens who express an opinion that does not coincide with the regime's position. Recently, we received a letter from the former deputy of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, now accused of state treason, Alexander Dubinsky. The facts, including the death and torture of the American journalist Gonzalo Lira, were confirmed by international human rights organizations and were mentioned in the report of the U.S. Department of State on the compliance of human rights in Ukraine in 2024. Just the other day, members of the Security Council received another letter, this time from journalist Diana Panchenko. She addressed the UN Secretary General with a request to take measures to protect political prisoners. She referred to the reports of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which recorded systematic cases of arbitrary detention, detention without official accusation, torture, and refusal of access to justice in the Kyiv regime. The letter contains a list of more than 500 victims of political persecution in Ukraine. Even a brief analysis of the content of these letters allows us to draw a clear conclusion. We are talking about a repressive machine created by Zelensky's regime, based on violations of basic human rights and freedoms. State security agencies, courts, and law enforcement agencies are used to intimidate society and prevent people from thinking. How many more members of the Security Council will ignore these cries for help and pretend that nothing like this is happening in Ukraine? And how many more Western sponsors of the Kyiv regime will ignore the overwhelming facts overshadowing corruption among the leaders of Zelensky's regime? At the beginning of the week, some Western media reported that a former investigator of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine managed to extract thousands of pages from internal documents revealing corruption schemes in the highest echelons of the Ukrainian government. Elena K., the name is not disclosed, was the head of the target group, which was tracking offshore assets. The election-published purchase-sale agreements and information on bank transfers confirm that Zelensky and his associates used a branched network of subcontractors to launder illegal revenues and subsequent acquisitions of elite real estate abroad. We are talking about a sum of more than 1.2 billion and hundreds of real estate objects, including in Spain, Great Britain, France, and Italy. I am sure that this is just the tip of the iceberg, but it is also being persistently tried not to notice in the West. Do you really not understand that keeping such rotten, corrupted, and hateful regimes undermines the remnants of your reputation in the world? Mr. President, if our Western colleagues knew how to speak the truth, they would have long ago admitted that the West for many years created direct threats to the security of the Russian Federation in Ukraine, and in fact, a protocol of the actions of the Kyiv regime on the extermination of the entire Russian and Russian-speaking population in the Ukrainian territory, grossly violating the UN Charter, which requires human rights, including linguistic and religious ones, numerous international conventions, as well as the Constitution of Ukraine. This recognition would be a great starting point for a long-term and stable settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. This is not happening yet, but some optimism suggests that some of our partners, first of all in the United States, clearly understand the need to eliminate the root causes of the conflict, without which it is impossible to resolve it. Such tendencies, which appeared in particular during the recent Russian-American summit in Alaska, frighten not only Zelensky's regime, but also his European supporters. Therefore, now they have put all their efforts to try to play off the positive understanding achieved in Alaska, or at least to pervert it. Most clearly, this is now being applied to security issues. In this regard, I would like to state the inability of new attempts to solve the issues of collective security around Russia, without taking into account our interests and concerns. It was such attempts that provoked the crisis situation in the Euro-Atlantic, a decision that has not yet been considered. We have repeatedly clarified our principal position on this matter, a cornerstone of mutual respect and equality. We stand up to any incitement to the sovereignty and independence of other states, and will not allow such attempts to be made against Russia. We will ensure our legal interests in the field of security firmly and rigorously. Under the guise of a guarantee of security, the collective West promotes unilateral, non-colonial initiatives to support Russia. This applies to the inevitably unfulfilled European plans for further militarization of Ukraine, to increase the military presence of NATO countries in the Black Sea region, including patrolling the airspace. At the same time, it is unapologetically proposed to limit the number of guarantor states to the key states of NATO. Colleagues, the provision of a guarantee of security is not a condition, but the result of peaceful regulation after the elimination of the primary causes of the conflict in Ukraine. Guarantees of security in the form in which they are voiced by our former European partners can only contribute to further degradation and strategic stability at the regional and global level. In this regard, it is appropriate to remind you of the initiative of the Ukrainian side itself, which was proposed to it in April 2022 in Istanbul. The Ukrainian negotiating team then outlined the main principles of the agreement on the completion of hostilities and the provision of stable regulations. Among them were the refusal of Ukraine to retreat to NATO or any other military bloc, and the confirmation of its neutral and non-nuclear status. In this context, the Ukrainian side proposed, and our delegation agreed, to develop guarantees of security, the participants of which would be all permanent members of the UN Security Council, as well as individual states that may be interested in joining this group of guarantors of security. It is obvious that the proposal of Kyiv implied that these guarantees would be equal, and the security of all interested parties, including Ukraine's neighbors, would be provided on an equal and indivisible basis. We supported this option. The document was approved, and we were ready to sign the official agreement. It is clear to us now, and we are ready to consider it. In contrast to various other schemes discussed, one way or another, they all lead to the fact that the remaining territories under Ukraine's control will be populated by NATO countries, up to the introduction of military contingents there. For Russia, this is unacceptable, as it will lead to an uncontrollable escalation of the conflict with unforeseen consequences. Those who promote such ideas are interested not in resolving the crisis, but in its preservation, possibly through a temporary freezing. This is not at all what we talked about in Alaska. We also record many attempts to distort the idea of holding the Russian-Ukrainian summit, the assertion that Russia is supposedly not ready for such a step. On the contrary, we have repeatedly confirmed that we can consider such a scenario, but on the condition of thorough preliminary preparation of such a meeting and its corresponding substantive content. Otherwise, it simply loses its meaning. We are ready to work in any formats, with the understanding that it will be honest and honest. A possible Russian-Ukrainian meeting at the highest level could draw up mutual agreements based on well-understood steps and measures after the summit in Alaska. However, what can be said here, if Zelensky publicly declares that he is not in the mood to discuss, for example, a territorial issue, thus challenging the U.S. President Donald Trump, who openly said that this should be a subject of negotiations. The head of the Kyiv regime also very unambiguously claims that no one can forbid Ukraine to join NATO, which also goes against the words of President Trump. Zelensky is also not going to abolish laws that de facto prohibit Russian, destroy Russian culture, education, Russian language mass media, and the canonical UPC. If the Ukrainian president is not ready for such a discussion, and in general does not want to make any compromises, which he himself has repeatedly emphasized over the past 1.5 weeks, it is not entirely clear why he insists on a meeting with President Putin. Mr. Chairman, to reach an acceptable resolution, which would guarantee the non-resumption of the conflict, it is necessary to activate diplomatic efforts. Let me remind you that during the third round of the resumed Istanbul negotiating track on July 23rd, we offered the Ukrainian side to think about creating 3 working groups on political, humanitarian, and military issues. We believe that this would allow us to consider the agenda points more specifically, and it would be useful for us to get closer to our positions and to find a way out of the Ukrainian crisis. More than a month has passed, but there is still no answer from Ukraine. We consider this issue, and in general the course of the negotiations in Istanbul, as a kind of lacquer paper of what Kiev is actually interested in diplomatic work or in empty PR and sabotage of constructive mediation efforts. Thank you for your attention.